Hey guys, this is Echo Soundworks, and we are in part 10 of this Ozone 8 tutorial course where we will be checking out probably one of the most important modules in Ozone 8 and in just Ozone's history as a plugin, and that's called the Dynamics. So it's part limiter, it's part compressor, it's part expander. Now you're going to use this to kind of tame and smooth out certain parts of your mix that may need taming. And this will usually occur before your final processing. So we have vintage tape on and we have vintage EQ. Those may get removed in the course of this tutorial course. I may remove the vintage tape, but for now we'll just leave it on. But just know that dynamic shouldn't be the last thing on your chain, because you're going to want to smooth out certain parts of your mix before you get to maybe your vintage limiter, or if you're going to go and if you want to go less vintage and more digital, you want to go with the maximizer, or maybe you want to do both, right? You want to do maximizer and then the vintage limiter, or vintage limiter to the maximizer. It wouldn't make sense to have vintage limiter, maximizer, and then dynamics, because the order of these modules do have an effect on how your track is going to sound once it's mastered. So let's just kill some of those real quick and reinsert an instance of the dynamic. Not the dynamic EQ, we want the straight up dynamics. All right, there it is. So I'm going to talk about the different controls, the different features, and then use it on this track that we've been working through. Now, just like with the EQ, you have a few different modes to view the information. Now, there's a lot of information and a lot that you can do with this. So this video will probably be about 25 minutes long, but definitely hang in there through it because it's some of the most powerful stuff in Ozone. And I'll try to go quick. So we have these three different view modes over here. Now, in this first mode, you're going to see basically 4 bands if you have all 4 bands active. This can, at most, display 4 bands, and it's breaking up your mix into frequency bands, and you can solo each band. So if we want to hear just our sub or our low end, I had to learn on. Let me put in the plug in there. So let's just solo this. There it is. Right. So we can solo each band, and we can move the crossover, the frequency crossover, so we can change what band is affecting which frequencies. Now, if you don't want certain bands, you can simply right-click and hit remove band, right? So if you just want 1 or 2 bands, you can do that. And with 1 band, you don't get the control of the frequencies. And you can right-click again to insert a band, and it'll just keep inserting bands in the order that they appear. Or if you don't want to do that, you just want to turn them off, you can also just push the I or the power button, right? So that's what's going on with these bands, and that's what you'll see in this first view. Now, while you're in this first view, the information you see down here with the threshold, the peak envelope RMS, these little sliders, and the compressor, that's going to be based on which band you select, and they're color-coded to help you out. So click on this one, everything's purple. Click on the mids, the low mids, here we got blue. The mids to the mid-highs, depending on how you have this set up, they're red, and then the high of the highs, it's going to be like hi-hats, high into your snare, white noise, that sort of stuff. That's going to be this weird, it's green-gray to my eyes. Hopefully it is to you guys too as well. Now, the second viewing mode, this is going to trace the gain reduction. It's going to superimpose it over the actual incoming audio. So if you want to see how much things are being reduced, if you're not trusting your ears and you just want to get some visual feedback, you have that option. Now, next is the detection view. Now, this isn't so much a view so much as it is another feature. This will apply, if you have it set up, a filter to the sound. So right now it's on none. We can set it up to high pass. We can set it up. There are these different options. You can do tilt, right? And then, of course, you can set the amount. So this will kind of add like a filter to the incoming signal. I usually have this set on none. This isn't something that I usually have on. I haven't played around with. You'll find that there are a lot of features in the Dynamics module that you may not need for your mix, and that's okay. That's one of the harder things about using the Dynamics module, in my opinion, is that there's so much, but less is usually more with it. So just be careful when you're using that. Just because you have all these different features, all these different options, you're not always using them. Make sure you're using them in context with your mix, actually listening to your track and making sure that the decisions you make are adding value to the mix. You're not just tweaking shit just because it's there and you can tweak it. All right, so those are the different views. Now, you also have 2 modes. You have stereo and mid-side. I love the mid side with the dynamics module. It gives you the control over all the frequency bands. So let's go back in both the mid and the side of your mix. So if you guys watched the video on equalization, we have it set up to mid side. You can do the same thing with the dynamics. So that can really help, especially if you're working with stem mastering. If you're working with a 2-track, a lot of times you'll just keep it in stereo because you can access the individual bands, and the individual bands are more than likely going to be panned, left, right, the higher up the mix you get, and the lows will be panned in the center. So you can definitely control a 2-track stereo like we have here with just stereo setting in the dynamics. But if you're working with stems and groups and your drums are separate from the vocals and the vocals are separate from the synths are separate from the bass, then mid-side becomes a really, really attractive feature. So let's go back to stereo mode for now. Let's go through some of the controls real quick. So we obviously have the on-off on the bands. You can right-click to delete bands, copy and paste bands, and you also have spectrum options, right? You can also access the spectrum options up here. So if we want to delete a band, we can hit remove band, right? Insert band. Now, over here to the right, there's some interesting features. There's band. You can toggle between the bands. And like I said, there's so many different ways to access the different bands. There's also this all section, which is quite useful once you think you have the dynamics module set up how you want. If you want to see how all the bands are being affected in terms of, you want to see where you have the threshold set on the compressor, what amount of volume's going over your threshold and how much is being compressed, this is where you're going to do it, the all button. Now, down here on the right, there are some very important controls. So right here, you have adaptive release, which is on by default. So an adaptive release is going to look at the incoming transients and kind of set your release based off of that information. Now, that's important because a lot of you guys are EDM producers or hip-hop producers. You're familiar with sidechain compression and the idea that compression can make music pump, right? That's not a desirable effect on a master bus. You don't want pumping. And pumping usually occurs when there is a certain interplay happening between how you have the attack set and how you have the release set. So that's what this adaptive release is for. Now, this auto button down beneath this is auto gain compensation. You can also set it manually, right? So right now we're on a all band gain. If we go over here, for instance, if we get off of all and we just go back to band 1, see the auto is set at 0, at 0, and at 0. Now if we go to all, we can turn things up or down for the entire gain of everything. Now that's helpful because the dynamics module will actually, depending on how hard you push it, it can make you lose some volume. So you might want to play around with that, but it's off by default. All right, so now that we got that covered, let's go talk about the controls in the actual bands themselves. So over here you have your limiter and you have your compressor. So it's kind of just in one. So I'm going to solo the mid-range of our mix. Right, so now we have a compressor and a limiter happening. So it's kind of that, it's both of those worlds. And you have controls for the limiter. Right, there's ratio, there's attack, release, and knee. You have the same controls for the compressor. Compressor? You think I'd be able to say that word after, I don't know, hundreds of tutorial videos. The compressor, it has ratios as well, and you can see that it's affecting it over here on this visual, this little visual. Same with the limiter. Now you see the limiter is just kind of at the top end, right? So that's why it's a limiter and a compressor. So now let's reinitialize, just reinsert the plugin real quick. You'll notice that by default, on a lot of the bands, they set the compressor to 12. The limiter's at 0 decibels, or unity gain. You'll notice that there's going to be a little bit of gain reduction happening just by putting the plugin on. Didn't even hear you. I didn't even notice that you left. So we have some reduction here in the low mids. Which isn't too crazy, but it's something to point out that a lot of times just by turning this on, you'll be affecting the sound. Now, let's talk about the last feature I want to kind of cover before we actually start applying this to our mix, and that is this parallel slider. This essentially sets up the plugin to basically be like a kind of a bus or an aux send, right? Parallel compression. You can set each band to its own percentage of dry-wet mix, which is actually really cool because you can do some quite creative things with this in a mastering sense, where you can push certain frequencies and push certain bands and then dial back the parallel so you don't get too much pumping and you don't get too much just a sound that you kind of wouldn't want on a master bus dynamic compressor limiter combo. And finally, I think I said that with that, but and finally, the last thing I want to talk about here, on the control where you set your threshold and of the limiter and the compressor for all the bands, you have this kind of a detection mode. You have peak, envelope, and RMS. So peak is going to work how you would expect it to work by default. It's going to set a threshold, and anything peaking over that threshold, it's going to reduce the gain based off of the ratio that you have set. Envelope's a little bit different. Envelope's going to look at averages over time, and then RMS is going to be the root mean square average over time. So these come more into play, I think, with stem mastering, kind of like with the mid-side potentially. If you stemmed out your song into groups, kick drum, sub, bass, rest of drums, synths, vocals, it's like 5 or 6 different groups. This becomes more important because on certain groups you might want to think, okay, if you're loading Ozone up on not your master but actual individual groups, and you want to use the dynamics on individual groups, RMS might be better for vocals or for certain bass lines that have a lot of movement, because it's taking an average, not a peak, right? So those are just 2 examples of really kind of source materials that have a wide dynamic range. You wouldn't want to use this necessarily on like your kick stem. So we're working with a 2-track stereo right now, so it's a little bit different. So I'm just going to keep it on peak. That's probably how I see it used in most of the presets, and most of the time when I'm using it, the best results I get on a 2-track stereo, I just simply have it set to peak. So let's go through some of the presets, speaking of which, and just see how they sound. So let's do analog high end.
Didn't even hear you. I didn't even notice that you left. I wasn't even looking. Oh, another. Didn't even hear you. I didn't even notice that you left.
I've actually always really liked the vintage warm, and I kind of start with that. And that might be because I have a tendency to underrepresent the mids in my mixes, and that's one of my kind of things I want to bring out in this mastering process with this track here is I want to get more mid range. So we can just start with that. The highs, I'm comfortable working with just 3 bands with this track. I don't foresee needing all 4 bands. So let's just mess around with it in mid-side real quick. So we're going to solo the kind of like the verse section.
I wasn't even looking. Oh, another way just to forget. On my own once again, break it off.
So let's go to the side and see if we have any sub-frequencies there. So I turned on the adaptive release and the auto gain because, again, I don't want to get pumping with whatever I do.
I wasn't even looking. Oh, another way just to forget. On my own once again, break it off, take me back. I was in the middle, but you pushed me to the other side.
So I'm getting a little bit of gain reduction in the mids, which is nice. Let's go to the sides and see if I have any gain reduction in the mids.
Wasn't even looking. Oh, another way just to forget. On my own once again, break it off, take me back. I was in the middle, but you pushed me to the other side.
All right, so I'm gonna bring the thresholds back up. I just did that to kind of hear things when I was soloing.
I wasn't even looking. Oh, another way just to forget. On my own once again. Break it off, take me back.
Now you'll notice that as I insert a band on the mid, that band also gets inserted on the side as well. So let's go to the mid and the high, and I'm going to solo both of those.
I wasn't
So I'm just taking out, I'm adding a little bit of compression on the highs, but I'm leaving quite a high attack time to preserve the initial transient of that sound. So let's see how that sounds in context now.
I wasn't even looking. Oh, another way just to forget.
Because I noticed earlier in the track that the highs in my when I went to mono
I wasn't even looking.
weren't as tight. I don't really know how to describe it. So that's all I'm trying to do is a little bit there.
I wasn't even looking. Oh, another way just to forget.
All right, let's go to the all bands view real quick here.
I wasn't even looking. Oh, another way just to forget. On my own once again. Break it off, take me back. I was in the middle, but you pushed me to the end.
Adding a little bit of highs here
I wasn't
to the side.
I wasn't even looking. Oh, another. I wasn't even looking. Oh, another way just to forget.
And I'm gonna add just about a little bit under a decibel of gain here.
I wasn't even looking. Oh, another way just. I wasn't even looking. I wasn't even looking. Oh, another way just to forget. I wasn't even looking. I wasn't even looking.
So I like how that sounds. Again, I've touched on this a little bit. You use this to smooth out certain parts of your mix. You're not going to use this to really drastically slam something when you're working on a 2-track stereo. Now, the reason why this dynamics module is really important in Ozone is because you'll see here that the gain reduction, if we go to the mid and we go to like the mid range here, we go to our gain reduction trace, you'll see that I have some gain reduction happening on those transients, which is helpful because I have set that based on not only frequency in my mix, but also the middle of my mix. Also, I have full control over how much the compressor, the limiter, is playing into the gain reduction, right? Now that becomes really important when you're going to ultimately use the maximizer in Ozone. I would say that every time you use Ozone, you're going to use the maximizer or at least the vintage limiter. The maximizer is what's going to pump up the perceived loudness, right? The RMS, if you're on the K scale, whatever it is, the LUFS, however you're metering, measuring, that's what's going to pump that up, right? Now, this is just kind of cleaning it up. It's getting it ready to make the maximizer more efficient. So we haven't touched on the maximizer yet, but I wanted to bring this up because it will give you better insight on how to use the dynamics. The maximizer is it's a sonic maximizer. It's limiter, right? It's basically going to increase the loudness of your mix, and you have these different modes that are going to dictate how it looks at the incoming signal. Well, you don't have control over frequency like you do with the dynamics, so that's why I'm saying you'll pretty much always use the dynamics module in Ozone.
I wasn't even looking. Oh, another way just to. I wasn't even looking. I wasn't even looking. Oh, another way just to forget. I wasn't even looking.
I'm going to go to the side real quick, and I just want to see what happens when I turn up the side.
I wasn't even looking. Oh, another way just to forget. I wasn't even looking. Oh, another way. I wasn't even.
actually really like that idea in this mix. Let's go to the mids and the side solo it.
I wasn't even looking. Oh, another way just to forget. Again, break it off, take me back. I was in the middle, but you pushed me to the other side. I wasn't even looking. Oh, another way just to forget. On my own once again, break it off, take me back. I wasn't even.
See, a slight effect. I didn't have a lot of problematic frequencies, and I've kind of addressed those right before with the equalizer. So let's listen to this with the drop now. I have it bypassed. All right, so I'm aware that we're getting a little bit peaking by 0.2 here on the going over unity on the master, but we'll address that as we go through. I don't want to, sometimes that happens, and we'll address that once we have a fuller picture of everything that we're using. But yeah, I'm gonna take the maximizer off for now. So I actually like the sound. It's a little bit more focused, a little bit more detailed.
Once again, break it off, take me back.
All right, so now in the next video, we're gonna be looking at the imager. And then following that, we're going to be looking at the maximizer. And then just giving you a roadmap for this, of course, we're going to look at the rest of the modules that we haven't touched on yet. So I'll see you there.